This is the butterfly talk, I guess, the other half of the talk for Lindsay. So I'm going to be talking more about the application space and the interface between computing and data, and what are the challenges that we're facing, and what does it mean to get into the exascale space. So there's two key components, I guess, that we've been working on. One is around high performance computing and scaling, of which we've had a project now going for, it's into its third year. It's a collaboration between NCI and the Euronet, as well as some support from Fujitsu. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to upscale our computational capabilities of various models in a very targeted way. In particular, we had some Euronet models that needed to be looked at for operational reasons, and also for climate and other critical applications. And then we followed on and did further tuning and trying to understand more deeply those models. And then into year 3, as well as converting a little bit further on those on that work, we've branched into some of the other spaces and application domains that we have at NCI, and starting to look at things like some of the new technologies that are coming out, as well as libraries on the system. We've been looking at these all the way through, but hopefully we're categorising and understanding this a little further. So the major drivers that are in the exascale domain for Earth system science research are around some of these things like modelling extreme and high impact weather events. So that's mainly from the Bureau of Meteorology. They also have the issue of numerical weather prediction on a daily basis to try and increase the resolutions, and I'll talk about that. The couple climate systems, both at a long century scale as well as in the seasonal scale, need to be addressed, and all of those do have some form of data assimilation to help train those models to make them more realistic. In Geoscience Australia and Bureau and inside the States, there's various implications for hazards and geophysics for Geoscience Australia and the universities, and monitoring the environment, as well as doing international research. And so there's some of those driving cases. Oops. So just put up here. Not maintenance. There you go. So in the numerical weather prediction space, so the Bureau of Meteorology had this sort of timeline of rollouts of what is run as the operational model. So operational in 2016, there's global, regional scales, city scales, and more extreme scales that weren't put in place. So that was called the Australian Parallel Suite 2. So that's what's been currently running our daily weather forecasts for both civilian and other applications. But going forward into the next round, so what becomes operational in 2017 and 18, and then further into 2019 and 20, the scales are increasing, the resolution's increasing, and that puts extra computational demand. And those models that have been running have got to get more performant to meet those particular targets. So we've been working both with the Bureau of Meteorology and other partners to try and meet those particular targets and to get ahead and find out where those scalability issues are for the future. So for the major atmospheric model, which holds a partnership together, comes out of the UK. It's called the UK Unified Model, and there's a number of different operational centres as a part of that, and they run all sorts of technical infrastructure bits and pieces, and we're heavily involved in how to do that particular scaling activity. And I'll talk a lot about partnerships throughout this talk, and one of the main things is that we can't do any of this stuff alone, and the amount of computation that's going on has already hit the exascale. It's just across different facilities, and we need to collaborate on bringing those results together. So in the Earth system model, so this is at the climate scale, it uses the same atmospheric model, just at a lower resolution, and it couples to different things. So the atmosphere here is the unified model, and the ocean is a model out of GFDL from NOAA. called MOM, and then there's a sea ice model, and then there's a couple are bringing that together. But for the climate systems going into the future, we've got terrestrial models that are handling the Australian landscape. The cable model that originally came out of CSIRO and then became a community model for Australia. There's biogeochemical models developed from CSIRO in Hobart, and they get coupled into that system as well. And then as we've gone on, there's an aerosol model that comes out of the UK that needs to be coupled into that system as well. So they're quite complex models that are being coupled together at slightly different resolutions to create a working model for climate. Now the outputs for some of that have gone into things like the CMIP report. So about 40 or 50 modelling centres around the world ran 100 years worth of simulations in different scenarios, and like I said, would have computed well in excess of an exaflop worth of computing power, and then produced reference data that was then needed to be analysed and brought together and put into other scenarios. And the NCI is one of the major nodes of that international network, so we had to, as well as help with the modelling activity, also help with how to make an international federation of data nodes that can make that data accessible and analysed and understand the value of those particular models. One of those particular cases is the ocean model itself, and just for interest, this is at a quarter of a degree, what an ocean model looks like, and then the next generation of model which we've been working on, if I can move this along a bit, is at a tenth of a degree. So I thought it might be interesting just to see what's the difference between a quarter of a degree model, which is hardly sort of modern science, but it is operational, on the left-hand side, and so you can see various sort of turbulences that are taking place. But on the tenth of a degree model, I don't know how well it's turning out for you in the audience, but you get much more. You get any resolution, full resolution of the different characteristics, and that's an isopycnal surface on the bottom of the ocean, down near the southern hemisphere, down near the southern poles. So there's a big difference in the science that can be done. Actually, at a quarter degree, there's not much science itself, but at a tenth of a degree, you do get science. And now we need to move on to try and do a 30th of a degree and to couple other components in. But I should say that at a tenth of a degree, we really don't have the size of machine that we need to fully exploit that model. We can do some research work, but not operational. But at a 30th of a degree is well in excess of what the current capabilities are at this stage. So we're quite keen to get the next system in place. Another example of something that we've worked on is to do with storm surges using a regional ocean model called ROMS, and having a look at the sea surface height under various conditions, so especially along the reefs area, having a look at what storm surges mean, and we've scaled up that particular model, and the Bureau have now taken on that scalability and put it into an operational framework, and now we're working on the next part of it, which is to couple at a high resolution and put a wave model into that system as well. Another thing that we've done is worked on this satellite called Himawari 8, which is a geostationary satellite sitting over, basically over the southern hemisphere, or particularly over Australia and Japan. It's a Japanese satellite from JMA, and this has vastly increased the resolution and frequency at which we can get data in our particular region, and that's been coupled into the numerical weather predictions, and which is very important to keep those models trained. But we can also find various events, and here is a particular volcano going off, a very short-lived event off New Guinea that wouldn't have been detected otherwise, but it was pulled up actually just after Himawari 8 data became available. Further into the Earth observation space is being able to do time series analysis. We've never been able to really analyse some of this data before because the capacities were too large and we really didn't manipulate the data and make it accessible for analysis. So now there's more than 30 years worth of Landsat data that's been processed up, including its products, and made into a regular form so that we can start to analyse that. And that's been work with GA and CSIRO. And from that we can start doing water detection, understanding what the state of floods and so on have been around the Australian continent. And then as we go forward, then now faster satellites go up, more satellites going up, taking more and more data streams. So in the European Commission, they put up these Sentinel satellites, and they're now interleaving with the next round of NASA missions to do with the Landsat data and other sort of satellite data coming in as well, and that's at a regional scale, including Indonesia, so we've become a hub for that work. Then once you've got a lot of this data and you've got other parts of the landscape data, you can start to do data assimilation again. You can couple it into land surface models and become part of sort of a more detailed description of what's happening in the Australian area. There is also activity around hazards, particularly around cyclone tracks. That's mainly driven from Geoscience Australia, and there are some parts from Euronet that we haven't connected up fully between the two agencies at the moment, but we're helping to flesh out and again scale those models and become a collaboration between us and GA and Bureau, which otherwise would have been quite tricky to do. One of the emerging areas for us has been the geophysics area. We did focus a lot on the Bureau and the climate cases and so on, but we saw that there was an opportunity for geophysics, in particular around magnetotellurics, which we've done a little bit of work, and Ross Brody talked about AEM before, and there was some talk about seismic inversions earlier as well. There's a lot of challenges around the geosciences space. Sort of like in the other areas, you do need lots of data. You need a lot of things going for you for these models to work. You can't just stick a model on the system and expect it to run, even if it's a great model. You need a lot of data. You need it from different domains. You need it cleaned up. You need it in a good form for computing. You need coverage. You need a lot of points and lines underneath to compare against to understand the value of the model. And then you can start getting into ensembles and uncertainty and starting to get into inferencing. So as well as having a look at our own local environment, we've been checking what's going on with our overseas partners, collaborators, and what we might import in. So there's a very good program that David Maidment led out of the US, out of this Kawazi Centre on National Flood Interoperability. And they've now got a roadmap, after doing some early work, they've got a roadmap of how to add more and more resolution and how to get that closer to an operational system. In fact, some of it has gone into an operational system as a result of this work. So they were able to do some research on the TAC facility in Texas, starting to couple the weather model, which is a WARF model, an open community, very simple model that's used operationally in various centres, and then start to couple it on to things like the elevation, have a look at stream flows around the US and start to get probabilistic flood forecasts out of that system. And some of the hydrologists in Australia are now looking at this and going, yep, we think we can get there as well if we can start to get the data working and bring the models in the right way. Further, for places like California, and a place called UNAVCO, which is an agency there. They're looking at what the impact is of floods and droughts and what's happening with the geodesy and the elevation of the Californian landscape. And so one thing you might not realise is when it doesn't rain, or when it rains, the land goes down a bit, and when it doesn't rain, the land comes up a bit. as well. So they're having a look at all of these factors and what does that mean for stream flows, and they're looking at all of their little sensors around the place for what's going on in the elevation and in the geodesy measurements as well. And the impacts are large because they're talking about, you know, what happens to the water, what happens to agriculture, what happens to the food in that system. Back into more central geophysics. Now that we've started to pull in some data from GA, it's possible now to think about doing the various inversions and doing something more realistic for, in this case, a state survey. The South Australian State Survey has been working with Geoscience Australia to start doing some operational inversions and finding out what's going on in SA, and that was a very early one. And since then we've done a bit more around the data, and hopefully we can get some more high resolution models out of that. Also in the seismic area, in oil and gas, which has not been an area that we've been working in particular, but they have particular heavy computational requirements, and from this talk from a guy from Chevron sort of talked about their model development and the computational requirements going forward in that. And there's that just talked about, I think, mostly on the computational side, but they of course bring in a lot of data as well and try to marry that into the model. And then in the more recent times, although we have been working on this for a little while now, is how to start thinking about processing genomes. And the main thing there is that the equipment for capturing all of the data out of genomes or processing it is becoming so cheap that you can buy these genome processing machines and put a lot of, get a lot of samples and start pumping it through. So we used to talk about, when we looked at our data storage graph, you could tell when the new telescope came in, an astronomy telescope, because you'd see a jump up whenever that occurred with the data capture. And in this case, you can sort of buy 10 telescopes, all in one go, and it becomes faster and faster because they can put in that equipment. And of course, there's real life benefits out of having a look at genomes, because you can start studying cancers and all sorts of other effects as well. So we've got a collaboration going with in genomic space to try and see what we can do in that area. I'd already mentioned probably enough on the atmospheric side, but we've done all sorts of works there to scale up the models, and Dale Roberts and Marshall Ward will talk on Thursday about two different aspects of how that work has been scaled up. And I'll briefly now move on to data, which had to come along for all of those other computational problems to be addressed. So as Lindsay mentioned earlier, we got some funding through one of these NCRIS areas called the RDSI to put in a high performance computing node, and there's sort of putting the infrastructure to build a system that scales up and that would address some critical problems that were identified around the Earth system. So that was our focus on the node. And as a result, researchers can start getting in there. You have enough, it's not just about the hardware infrastructure, but if we organise those data sets in the right way, people could start getting in and using them much more freely. And we've certainly achieved a goodly part of those goals at the moment. So there's a lot of data that's now being brought into the facility, and it's easy to find that data, or relatively easy to find that data, and that's from climate models or Earth observation, digital elevation and bathymetry, seasonal climate, various observations from the Bureau, and some reanalysis. Some of these are global, not just in the Australian context. But what's not been available before to anyone is all of these on the one site and on file systems, and actually organised in a useful fashion. So one that we're working on at the moment is the geophysics data collection, which has grids and surveys and then lines and points, and we're organising that to become more unified and available for the various models. So if you think of, there's a categorisation, I guess, that NASA had produced some time ago, sort of talking about what's the level of data. So you start off with raw and instrument data, and then you started getting into calibrated and gridded and value-added products and so on and so forth. And we're particularly working on making the data available from calibrated all through to derived products, and then turning that data around into something that's useful. More generally, it's not just a data product, it has to work with other data as well. So we've tried to understand and unify that space. And we've called that data high performance data because it's much more easily to get into it, and it's programmably accessible. So after assembling all of this data at a facility like NCI, it's very important that we can do high performance computing around that. We've created things called virtual laboratories to get into that data as well, but we also have to make it much more accessible. So we put on data services around that, and we've chosen data and data services so you can either be on the system directly or you can be on the network, and it's pretty much the same sort of interface. So we're using, in particular, NetCDF protocol and HDF underneath that. And then using the DAP protocols for network interfaces and other things like OGC services, different things to people. We're also working quite heavily on how to make that data connected in a machine-readable context as well. So one of the issues on this is you need to make the data fully accessible, fully workable for the high end, for the high impact, for the high, for the big models, because if the data's not there, you will stall CPUs, you'll waste time, but you've also got to make it accessible for the small scale, for the catchment zone, for the plot of land as well, to extract full value out of that for the broadest community. And we have been working on this model of how well integrated data is. So you can think about interdisciplinary, just useful for one particular subject, or multidisciplinary, just sort of lining it up all next to each other but not useful for one another. You can start to think about brokerage, so that the data is sort of usable if you put a broker interface in between various things, or you can get to full transdisciplinary data where the data is sort of usable directly, as it sits inside the system. So we've been working very hard to see if we can get to transdisciplinary data and therefore make it much more accessible for a whole bunch of models and ways of analysing data. The other thing that we've been doing is increasing the transparency and reproducibility of the data. So there's no point in having data on there if no one knows how it was generated, or if you run a model on it, what were the different algorithms, what was the different ways of generating that data. And you have to, now in your analyses of data, if you're going to publish, you've got to say where it came from, what version it was, what was its provenance. You've got to have some reference point. So we've worked quite carefully on doing that. So we've got provenance capture services in place. And the other thing with connected data is you can start working out who's used the data, what happened to the reference data, how is it generated, how is it replicated, and then when someone's using it and publishing off it and referencing it, well, what was the connection back into the original data as well. So that's just one particular application. We worked on a thing called the Climate and Weather Lab to make it possible for people who are not deeply into the models to just get in there and start using that infrastructure more easily, and the tools to be connected. So there's a whole bunch of easy environments on that. And the other thing, and the last thing that I'll talk about, is starting to get into the deep learning space. And we've been looking at this for a while about how things will go, and in fact John Wolford talked earlier on some machine learning that's starting to take place, and it's happening in our local sphere. But in this case I wanted to talk about an example from a collaborator from NASA, Rahul, who was looking at the NASA's archives of all of their satellite imagery, and there were some few use cases that they derived out of how could we use that satellite imagery much more interestingly. So one was they were looking at things like volcanic eruptions, looking at whether or not they could detect whether whether it was a volcano, whether it was bushfires, or whether it was something else that had taken place. So they found a particular event inside of the archive and then started to try and work on machine learning techniques and algorithms that sit underneath, which I'm not going to go into, to try and understand what the rules were and then build up an archive of all of their events. And in this case, it was actually on the on cyclone events. That the same system applied. See if they could find the archive, see if they could catalogue in a machine readable way all of the events, and then be able to match a particular event that was happening at the time very quickly to the archive. And in this case, they found an application for that, which is they want to get closer to nowcasting on cyclone events to understand what are the risks, and they can't model fast enough for that to happen. So they're really mining that archive and trying to work out how quickly and how accurately they can do that. And so they did do some matching of different events and got up to nearly 88% accuracy, which was about as good as what they could do with forecasters as well, just to understand what the events were. So, and they could do it a lot faster than a forecaster can do. So it's just one application that's sitting in front of us for some machine learning techniques that can be readily applied. So my final slide is we're working in the area of Exascale. The ones that I've shown are sort of the big ones that are help driving Exascale. There's a few others, but they're sort of exemplar cases. It takes now compute and it takes data to make those systems work, to get into the real world rather than just in a modelling framework. For that model to work well, and that takes a lot of work to put it into that framework. But once it's there, it's a valuable asset. It needs expertise and understanding how to tune and make sure you do get there. But then it does become easy. And then no one centre can do it alone. We've got a lot of collaborations, and I've put up a number of the logos there that we're working very carefully with, and we're working with all sorts of overseas centres to make sure that we're importing in the best of models, and we're collaborating about what we're finding, so that we're doing true international research and international trusted platforms. So that's it.